Welcome to the Rationally Speaking podcast, where we explore the borderlands between reason and nonsense. I am your host, Massimo, and with me, as always, is Julia Galef. Julia, as if I didn't know today, what are we going to talk about?
Well, Massimo, we are here live at the 7th Annual NECSS, Northeast Conference on Science and Skepticism. Say hi, guys. Woo! Yeah. We're delighted to be back, and this is a very special episode of the Rationally Speaking podcast. As some of you are aware, but maybe not all of you, we've been doing the podcast for a little over 5 years now, 130-something episodes, and
58 guests.
58, yes.
I counted today, yeah.
I felt like I needed something to complete that trio of numbers, right. But I lacked it, so thank you. And today, this live podcast will be the last episode that Massimo and I record together. Because, yeah.
I'm glad there was no applause on that one.
Whew, that went well.
Yes.
Massimo is
retiring,
is moving onward and upward to bigger and better things for some reason. It's an amicable separation, you know.
That's right. It's not a divorce.
We still love you guys, you know. It's not your fault. Sometimes a co-host and his co-host just decide they need to live separately.
By the way, that also means that there is a job opening. So at some point, you know, somebody will step in. But I think what's going to happen is actually the podcast will continue, obviously, with Julia. In fact, you guys already have had the first episode taped.
That's right. I taped my first
After Me episode, yes.
The first episode of the post-Massimo era. Or the era of Julia, depending on your naming preferences. Right. I recorded an interview with Sean Carroll on the question, discussing the claim, the many worlds interpretation is probably correct. The many worlds interpretation of quantum physics.
Too bad I wasn't there.
Correct.
It's probably not. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, so I think it'll be different, but it'll be good. And I encourage you to tune in and help usher in the era of Julia.
But today, we're going to do something different. Now, at some point, we thought, well, maybe for the last show, Julia's just going to ask me about, you know, the future of skepticism and all that sort of stuff that nobody really wants to hear about. So we figured, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do instead is, since we have had 132 episodes, lots of different topics and guests, we're going to actually revisit some of the topics and ask ourselves if we actually have changed our mind about something that we have discussed over the last 5 years. I thought for a second I'm actually doing one of those, you know, all of Shakespeare in 60 minutes kind of thing.
Just talk really, really fast.
Really
faster
fast
than I already talk.
But all 132, but I think that's not going to work. So in that vein, what about you? What's the first thing that comes to mind in terms of past topics that you might have changed your mind about?
Yeah, there have been a number of things that have come to mind. Either I consciously realize, I no longer believe such and such, or I listen to an old episode or sometimes read an old blog post, and I think, I said that? I didn't remember I used to believe that. So, yeah, there's a bunch. One that has been sort of on my mind recently is we've covered in various forms the relationship between rationality and emotion. And I have brought up this trope, which I've sort of helped popularize in talks as well, of the Straw Vulcan. So the Straw Vulcan is, I got it from TV tropes. It's sort of an archetype in TV and movies, and it's this caricature of rationality, the same way a straw man is like a caricature of someone's argument. And the Straw Vulcan is the character in the movie who is officially the rational one, but what that means in practice is that he goes around like sniffing at how illogical other people are being and refusing to, you know, partake of fun or love or appreciate beauty because that's not rational, and like expecting other people to behave rationally and being flummoxed when they don't. And so my point whenever we talk about rationality and emotion, and I use this trope as an example of how society tends to view rationality, my point is that this is this is not rationality. Like there's no reason that you have to or that you should abandon emotion or fun or beauty or love in order to make rational decisions.
But now you decided that you do.
Are you wondering where I'm going with this?
Yes, I am wondering where you're going with this.
So I still believe that is a caricature of rationality and not the right way to practice rationality. But in the 4 years or so since I gave the Straw Vulcan talk, I've just come to realize that it's less of a fabricated caricature than I had thought. Basically, because I've met Straw Vulcans. I keep meeting them.
Some of them are in the audience. No, maybe not.
And I'm not talking about my buddy Mitch, who's I think in the audience, who has an elaborate and beautifully rendered Straw Vulcan costume that he wears to skeptic conferences, and it's really quite a sight to behold.
Talk about an inside joke, but yes.
People should put a photo of it on the website. I'm talking about people who actually do espouse rationality or endorse rationality, but go around refusing to engage in fun or beauty or love because it's not rational or not efficient or not productive, and also who sort of expect other people to behave rationally and then are surprised when they don't. And so I guess my revised position is this is still sort of a great example of how not to do rationality, how to do rationality wrong. But I don't feel anymore like I can complain about society fabricating a caricature of rationality, because I think this is more of like a genuine failure mode of trying to be rational than it is a slanderous accusation.
Okay. So there are actual Straw Vulcans out there. That's an interesting. I mean, I actually agree. I've seen people like that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we did start out the very first episode talking about rationality, and particularly, of course, a podcast called Rationally Speaking. Particularly, we asked the question of why be rational, and I wonder if we changed our mind. I don't actually remember what we said, so it doesn't matter. But I didn't go back and re-listen to it. In fact, I never listened to an episode. That's interesting. I never actually heard one of our episodes taped.
Once is enough?
Yes. But why be rational is a good question, right? Because in fact, in other episodes, we did cover sort of the same. We went back to the same topic from different perspectives. For instance, we had an episode where we discussed with a guest, in fact, the situation where there are situations where, in fact, it pays off not to be entirely rational, not to be, depending on what you mean by rational, of course, because it's not like the definition of rationality is in and of itself that straightforward. So this is not one of those things that I necessarily changed my mind about, but I have certainly refined my understanding of over the last 5 years. And I've sort of arrived at the conclusion that the answer to the question of why be rational is not necessarily because, let's say, it is what gets you the best answers about how to navigate the world. Because it is true, actually, that sometimes irrational or slightly irrational people that are not entirely rational, probably have a better life or probably have, achieve more in certain areas than people who try to stick to the fundamentals of logic and rational thinking. I think actually went back to a debate that happened during the end of near the end of the 19th century. And this was when William James published a very influential essay, The Will to Believe, I think, where he was defending the idea that it is perfectly fine to believe in things that don't exist or that possibly don't exist. He was referring to God, because that makes our lives better. James, of course, was a pragmatist. And at the time, the response that was provided by, and now the name of the author escapes me, but we'll post it on the podcast website. The response was no. Believing, trying to believe only things that are real, things that are acting rational. It's a moral imperative. It's not a question of you feel better about yourself if you do it or if you don't do it. It's not a question of you're gonna get ahead of in life. Better or not. It's a question of, to proportion one's beliefs to the evidence, as David Hume famously put it. It's a moral question. It's just unethical to knowingly accept beliefs that are in fact not truth, things that are in fact not truth. And I basically I went back to that, and to me now it has become a question of an axiomatic question. It's rationality is something that I want to do because I think it's the right thing to do, the consequence is more or less be damned, which may not be rational, by the way.
Well, so actually, you've described this moral imperative as if believing true things is sort of inherently good or virtuous. But I think at least what James was James the one who defended the moral imperative? Yeah.
Yes.
I think what he was saying was he gave this example of a shipbuilder. I might be conflating a different example, but a philosopher gave an example of a shipbuilder.
That's generic enough, yes.
who did not, he didn't try very hard to find out whether his boat was seaworthy. He had no reason to believe it wasn't, but he didn't, try to test that belief, and the ship sank. And James said, the shipbuilder, he didn't deceive anyone, and in fact, he believed the ship was seaworthy, and therefore, he wasn't deceiving himself either. But he didn't try to find out the truth, and the problem with having false beliefs or not trying to ferret out your own false beliefs is that believing false things can cause even a well-intentioned person to do a lot of harm. And so you sort of owe it. You don't know what false beliefs you have, but you sort of owe it not just to yourself, but to the rest of the world, to make your beliefs as true as possible, so that you can do right by them.
Yeah, I suppose that's a justification. Yeah, that's an extended justification for wanting to seek truth. So, but at some point, we all take. I mean, that is one thing that we discussed in the podcast a number of times from different angles. At some point, you have to start with some axioms about or some assumptions about what you do and why you do it. And it's not like people have forever tried to provide sort of foundations to their belief system, right? And this goes not just for, of course, religion, but even for things like mathematics or logic themselves, right? So we always have, and where do you get this from? And okay, where do you get that from? And you want to go down to the bottom, as the word foundation implies, right? The idea that knowledge or that our belief systems are like an edifice, they're like a building. There is a foundation, and of course, if the foundation is not very solid, then the whole thing could crumble down no matter how good it is. It's pretty clear at this point that foundational projects in all areas have failed. There's no foundations to logic, there is no foundations to mathematics, and therefore there is no foundation to science, there is no foundation to any other belief system or way of acting. What it is so we need a different metaphor. And the metaphor that I prefer at this point was introduced by William Quine in the middle part of the 20th century. And it's the metaphor of a web of beliefs, right? So knowledge and the way we understand the world is like a web of interconnections. And some of these threads are much more thick than others. In other words, we think they're much more reliable. So, the basics of mathematics it's a very strong, or the basics of logic, it's a very strong thread. Empirical evidence from the senses tends to be actually fairly foundational thread. I shouldn't use the word foundational. Fairly strong thread, because without senses we can't do anything. We cannot even read, a computer output or anything like that. And then there are things, on the other hand, that are threads that can be changed, altered, reconnected, cut out, that sort of stuff. What that does is it gives you the idea, a very strong image, that nothing is beyond criticism. Nothing is, by definition, cannot be touched. Even, in fact, Quine said, even the laws of logic themselves may have to be altered if we understand the world in a better way. But there is no place on the web where you actually rely completely and you say, if that goes, then everything else crumbles. Nothing ever crumbles because it's all interconnected in that kind of interesting way. So I think that is a better way of thinking about knowledge. And that to me was a relief, because once I embraced that, it's sort of then the entire issue of, well, but what is the basis for logic, mathematics, science, etc.? It just goes away. That question makes no sense anymore. And it's a question that people are trying to answer for hundreds of years, and they failed.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is kind of parallel to one of my own evolutions, which is we've talked a lot about philosophical thought experiments as a tool of reasoning, and especially in ethics, where a lot of philosophical thought experiments will force you to notice an inconsistency in your own intuitions. For example, a generic person, would be willing to pull a switch that would cause a train to hit one man in order to save the lives of 5 children, but I wouldn't be willing to push the man off the bridge to stop the train to save the lives of 5 children. And so, you know, how do you reconcile that inconsistency? Or, you know, I would consider it my duty to jump into a pool to save a drowning child, even if I ruined an expensive suit in the process. But I don't feel a moral obligation to donate money equivalent to the cost of the suit to save the lives of children who I can't see across the world, et cetera. So those are
That's
the
the
kind of
utilitarian arguments from Peter Singer, who actually was one of our guests. Yes.
That's right. That's right. And we should talk about utilitarianism at some point today too, because my thinking has evolved on that as well. But I used to be quite troubled by those inconsistencies, and felt like there must be a correct way to resolve that inconsistency. Just like if you're reading a mathematical proof and you start out with a true statement, and then you end up with a clear contradiction, like 1 = 2, then something must have gone wrong along the way. And so I felt like I must be able to find the point where things went wrong. And so I think one way that my thinking about ethics has evolved is that I've just really internalized the fact that our moral intuitions did not develop they weren't installed from the top down, I think, and there was no reason for them to evolve to be consistent with each other. The different systems of cognition, of reasoning in our brain evolved somewhat separately from each other at different points in time, and in response to different evolutionary pressures, social and physical, etc.
So you would agree with Walt Whitman, who said that. So I contradict myself.
If you force me to.
I am large enough to contain multitudes.
Well, I think that statement gets used as an excuse.
Gets abused, yes.
Yeah, to not have to admit that you're not making sense.
Right.
So I don't want to use it. I don't want to invoke it in this case. I guess I'm just saying that I have to fall back on this web of knowledge, or in this case, web of moral beliefs,
right.
And just deal with the inconsistency in some way, but not.
So my approach.
Not feel like I have to resolve it.
So my approach to the same problem has evolved in a different way, although not necessarily incompatible with what you're saying, and it has evolved in part because of reading or listening to people like Peter Singer. I mean, Singer is very smart guy, very nice guy, incidentally, and he's somebody who you definitely want to engage if you're seriously thinking about ethics. But you do come across these kind of things, and then you say, well, there really is no consistent answer from them for me to provide. These are really situations where either you accept that most people are just really bad at ethical reasoning or bad people, or there's something wrong with the approach, that particular ethical approach, utilitarianism in this case. By the way, of course, you all know this, but utilitarianism is, of course, that approach to ethical moral philosophy that says that the right thing to do is always what maximizes people's happiness and minimizes people's pain, or both of them at the same time. So it's a maximizing or minimizing of a particular quantity. And of course, we can have a discussion for the entire afternoon about what happiness means and how you measure it and so on and so forth.
But what maximizing means.
What maximizing and under what circumstances. But the basic idea is simple enough. So it is thinking about these kinds of things, and in fact having Singer on the podcast that forced me, because he did come up with that particular example. In his case, I think it was the expensive Italian leather shoes instead of the suit. But it's close enough, right? That's the same idea. And of course your response is, no, forget the child. I'm going to save my shoes, right? No, wait, no. No, right. That would be one way to be consistent, right? That would be one way to be consistent. Now, what I think it's happening there is that another option is simply to reject that entire way of thinking. So we talked about this on the podcast a number of times. Philosophers over the last 2.5 millennia have come up with a number of what I call ethical frameworks. These are not theories as much as ways to think about ethics, right? Utilitarianism is one. Deontology is another one. This is the idea that there are certain rules that are absolute. Think about 10 Commandments, of course. It's a classic deontological system. But in secular terms, Immanuel Kant is probably the philosopher that came up with the most rational sort of the ontological system. And then there is a number of others, one of which is called virtue ethics. It goes back to Aristotle and other philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome. And as you know, over the last several years, I've moved dramatically away from, I was never a deontologist to begin with, with all due respect to Kant, but this just, he hasn't convinced me. But I entertain different forms of utilitarianism. There are different varieties, different versions of being a utilitarian. And then I just came across these kind of problems we're just discussing over and over, and I finally said, this is not going to work. So the virtue ethics approach is very different, because for the ancient Greek Romans, the question of, is this the right thing to do? Is to donate the money that you would have used to buy your suit or your expensive shoes in order to save children on the other side of the earth, is that the right thing to do or not? Would have been a nonsensical question. That would not have been the kind of question that ethics is concerned with. The question that ethics is concerned with, as far as the Greek Romans were concerned, is what kind of life am I supposed to be living? What is the good life? And by good, they meant a moral life, not just a life of frolicking and happiness and pleasure. So once you put it that way, then the entire thing, you look at the entire thing very differently. The focus becomes not specific actions, but you're nurturing your own character. You're trying to be the best person you can. You're trying to learn and think hard about what is the best way of being a good person. And then any specific action, any specific situation becomes its own test of your character. And so there's no rule, there's no general rule, there's no maximizing this or minimizing that, there is no set of specific rules. It's a question of, well, let me see, this is the problem that I'm faced with today and right now, and here's my best way, my best shot at it. And tomorrow the situation may be different and I may look at it in a different way. I'm not saying that this solves those problems as much as dissolves them, because it really makes you think of ethics in a completely different fashion.
I mean, what I was trying to say is that I don't think that there's any, I don't think it's feasible to try to be a utilitarian in every respect and try to make all your moral intuitions align with utilitarianism, but I still think that abandoning it entirely is the wrong way to go. Like the thing that I see happening with virtue ethicists, whether they call themselves that or not, is let's say you can, you hear about a tragedy happening on the other side of the world, and as a virtue ethicist, you might cultivate compassion for those people and feel sad for them, and you're practicing the virtue of caring, of compassion, but you're not actually helping them. Whereas by contrast, a utilitarian might, I don't know whether or not they would feel emotion, like feel moved for those suffering people.
It depends on whether they're Straw Vulcans or not.
Yeah, but if they donate money to save those people, then the people whose lives were saved don't care whether you felt compassion or not. They care whether their lives get saved. And so I think, I'm not saying you practice virtue ethics this way, but I think it's because it's so much easier to just, there are easy ways to sort of demonstrate compassion and caring that don't require you to actually try to help the world. And I think it's easy to fall back on those ways if you're not sort of pushing yourself in the direction of utilitarianism.
Yeah, but I don't think that actually is the way virtue ethics is supposed to work. So
there's no directions for how it's supposed to work.
That's one of its advantages.
No,
that's right. That's exactly right. Now, first of all, one of the misconceptions is that if you're a virtue ethicist, you don't care about consequences. Of course you care about consequences. They just are not the only criterion, right? For a utilitarian, utilitarians are also known often as consequentialists, and for a utilitarian, that's all it matters. That's the focus of action. That's the focus of thought. Virtue ethicists or any other, I think, actually reasonable person will take consequences into account, but they're not overriding. They're not the only thing you take into account. Every situation becomes different. So a virtue ethicist actually might send money, or it might do something else. It might, for instance, a thing that is important for virtue ethicists is this idea that we live in a society that is made of sort of expanding circles, which is actually one of the metaphors used by Singer, interestingly, right? But if you live in expanding circles, it means that the circles that are close to you are, in fact, deserving of more of your attention than the sinkholes that are farther from you. Not because those people are less important in any absolute sense, but because you have much less of an impact. When anything you do has much more of an impact locally, if you start, volunteering for your local organization as opposed to traveling on the other side of the world, if you start behaving in a particular way that can serve as a role model for others in your own community, if you start whatever problems it is that concerns you, let's say poverty. Poverty is everywhere. You don't have to go to the other side of the world to deal with it. It's also around the corner. And so the idea is not that you ignore the other side or you don't do anything about it. The idea is that you set your priorities according to different kind of criteria.
But there's lower hanging fruit. By many orders of magnitude, there's lower hanging fruit in terms of being able to reduce poverty or disease or suffering in general in some parts of the world than other parts of the world. And in the West, we've picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and just by any sort of reasonable calculation, it takes much more money to reduce poverty in the West because we're sort of out in the tail end of having reduced poverty than it does to bring someone out of poverty.
But that kind of reasoning brings you quickly to the idea that everybody here is being a really, really bad person because they spent money for coming here to NECSS listening to us instead of saving children on the other side of the world. And I resist that kind of conclusion. I don't think you guys are that bad. You see what I mean?
I think that's a common reaction to this kind of information or this kind of dilemma. And the position I'm trying to argue for is not, like, I think what you're doing is you see the conclusion of this reasoning is, well, then I'd have to, like, either give away everything I own or, consider myself equivalent to a genocidal killer. And that's clearly...
You think that's a false dichotomy?
Well, that's sort of like the logical conclusion of that train of thought.
Exactly.
And that's, like, unacceptable and absurd. And so therefore I'll reject the entire utilitarian premise.
Right.
And what I'm trying to say is, no, the utilitarian premise still has a lot going for it. It's still true that, we can do a lot more good helping people on the other side of the world who maybe we don't see or feel compassion for viscerally because they're not in front of us. But we don't have to take it to its logical conclusion.
Yeah,
that's what the I contain multitudes buys you, that you can,
Yes.
That you can be more utilitarian than you were before and do more good without having to be forced to accept the logical conclusion that you have to give away everything you own.
I see your point. However, I don't think that my objection to utilitarianism comes only from looking at the logical end of it. I think that way before you get to the logical end, you ought to start feeling bad about yourself if you're a utilitarian. You don't need to go all the way to divesting yourself of everything, which not even Singer does. Singer actually, to his credit, donates a large chunk. I mean, I'm talking something like 20 or 30% of his salary, I think, at least, for good causes. But even of course, if you're looking at the logical endpoint, even Singer is a monster anyway because he doesn't give up 90% of it. But he's doing a lot. But I think that the problem actually comes much earlier for utilitarianism, much earlier than you get to the logical endpoint. You really ought to start feeling bad about yourself almost immediately if you're a utilitarian. That said, how about we change topic and go to another thing that I'm actually changed my mind about?
Oh, yeah. More?
I know. It's amazing, right? In 5 years, I managed to change my mind about at least 3 or 4 things.
I have to say, just as a brief tangent, I've been, like, repeatedly surprised how I'll be interviewing someone who talks about the importance of changing your mind and how we shouldn't be afraid to change our mind, and everyone's wrong about so many things, and you shouldn't be ashamed of that. You should change your mind. And then I ask them, so when have you changed their mind? And they're like, huh. This happens a lot.
Yes.
It's just much easier to
What was that title of the book that we interviewed one of the authors of, Everybody Makes Mistakes Except Me, or something like that.
Right.
Carol Tavers.
Anyway, so I want to hear what else you've changed your mind about.
Okay, this is going to be very esoteric, I suppose, but I did change my mind in a fairly dramatic way about this one, and that's mathematical Platonism. Ooh.
This is one of the first things we discussed.
It is
at the first meetup where I hung out with you.
Yeah, it is an early thing, and also in fact one of the things that made me change my mind is one of our guests, Max Tegmark, who talked about the mathematical universe hypothesis, and he finally nailed it for me. He convinced me that he's wrong. is just complete. All right, so let me tell you this. So first of all, the basics, right? So mathematical Platonism is this idea that is, in fact, very widespread among both mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics. So this is not something that just a few cuckoos, unless you think of mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics as cuckoos, which, there is ground for that. But the majority of practicing mathematicians apparently are convinced that what they are doing with mathematics is to discover things, not to invent them, right? So mathematics is not a human invention, it's a discovery of something. Well, if it is a discovery of something, the question is, well, discovery of what? What are these things, these mathematical objects? And that's why, of course, from there, the step is very short to becoming some sort of Platonist. Plato, of course, was the guy who said that there is a whole world of true ideas, ideal versions of everything, of which the current world, the world that we actually inhabit, it's just a pale reflection, right? So go back to the image of the metaphor of the cave, for instance, in the Republic. Now, nobody today, or very few people, I assume today, is a full-fledged Platonist. We don't think that there is an ideal chair out there of which all actual chairs are mere copies. Or as one of the early critics of Plato put it, maybe there is ideal dung out there of which all pieces of crap are an instantiation. But there are modified versions of Platonism, and the strongest modified version of Platonism is, in fact, mathematical Platonism. Is this idea that mathematical structures or mathematical forms are actually, in some sense, mind-independent. They're not out there, it's not like you can point a telescope and discover them, but you can discover them in some interesting way. As I said, this is actually a majority position among mathematicians. Now, to the rest of us, presumably feels kind of weird, I would hope, right? But I was, when we started the podcast, I was actually intrigued by this idea because it does have very good arguments to go in its favor. First of all, if the practitioners, the professionals of a discipline tells you, what, I can't explain this thing, but I really feel like, the Pythagorean theorem or Fermat's last theorem or you name it, was in some sense there for me to discover. I didn't make it up as opposed to, coming up with a new game or like inventing chess or something like that, then you really need to take them seriously. I mean, these are the professionals. These are the ones that actually know what they're doing and how they're doing it. So they talk about the role of intuition in mathematics, for instance, the role of induction in mathematics. Most people think the mathematicians just proceed analytically by deductive proof, but in fact, comparatively little mathematics is done that way. A lot of mathematical conjectures are arrived at by intuition or by induction, the same way in which we arrive at scientific discoveries. And then eventually somebody may or may not figure out a deductive proof for it. So there is that. There's also the famous argument based on the so-called unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. This idea that, look, if we really were inventing this stuff out of whole cloth, how come that from time to time mathematics comes out to be spectacularly useful for scientific applications, to actually describe aspects of the world, even though the mathematicians had worked on that particular area for decades without really going in that direction. They were not interested in applied things. This is actually a valid point, and it reflects actually one of the standard arguments in favor of scientific realism, in favor of the idea that scientists are actually going out there getting closer and closer to the truth as opposed to just producing, I don't know, something like empirically adequate explanations. This is an argument that was proposed by Hilary Putnam, an influential philosopher in the late 20th century, and he put it in these terms. He said, if scientists were not actually getting closer and closer to the truth, to the way things actually are, it would be a miracle if that scientific theories just happen to work out so well in practice, even though they don't actually necessarily describe reality the way it actually is, or close to it. And Putnam was the same one that actually proposed that argument also in terms of mathematics. So all of that kind of convinced me that at least to be open to the idea. And the more I thought about it, I said, well, okay, so that means that my ontology, that is my conception of what exists in the world, now has to be a little broader than it used to be. It used to be just physical objects. Now I have to admit that there are other things that might exist in an interesting sense of the word exist, and that might be sort of accessed in a different way than going by the five senses. Okay, then that happened over a period of years. Like I started thinking that this was increasingly weird. And I said, okay, there are actually objections to these things. First of all, if the mathematical objects exist out there somewhere independent of the mind, how do we get access to it? A classic objection is, if you get access to the empirical world through your senses, but how is it that all of a sudden mathematicians have developed this sort of sixth sense that allows them to have intuitions about things that don't actually exist physically? Where does that come from? I can come up with an evolutionary explanation for why we evolved the five senses. I can't come up with an explanation for why we evolved a mathematical sense or mathematical intuition. So there's all sorts of interesting, and then of course there's the issues like, what do you mean by existence? If these mathematical forms exist, where do they exist? And in what sense the word existing do they exist? And then Max came to the show. And so Max
about a year ago.
Yeah. So Max is a really nice guy, very bright mathematician who came up with this idea that not only mathematical Platonism is true, not only the universe is described by mathematics, but in fact every conceivable internally coherent mathematical structure exists out there. In other words, the reason we have a multiverse, according to Max, is because you have to instantiate every single possible mathematical structure. And I looked at it and I said, that's just crazy. What do you mean by mathematical structure, first of all? What do you mean by instantiating? And how do you know that there is a multiverse anyway? I mean, that really didn't seem like science at all and barely mathematics. And then a few months after our show, Max came to the Graduate Center here at CUNY, a few blocks from here, invited by the philosophy program to give a talk about the mathematical universe. And so we had a nice chat before the talk, and I said, I'm really curious about how this is going to go, because now you have an audience of professional philosophers, many of whom are logicians, philosophers of mathematics, and metaphysicists, or metaphysicians, depending on how you put it. And so, the Q&A, this is going to be interesting. And I have to explain, so if you have never been to a philosophy conference or colloquium, the way this works is interesting, and it's different from the way it works in science. So the speaker gives a talk for about 45 or 50 minutes, which is more or less what you do in the sciences as well. But then in the sciences, usually there is about a 10-minute question and answer, and then everybody goes to have cheese and wine. Actually, typically they go to have bad chips and stuff like that, no wine. In philosophy, you have 1 hour or so, 50, 55 minutes of the actual talk, and then it's the 5 minutes intermission, and then there is an hour of Q&A. So you really get to grill the speaker, very in a lot of details, and usually there is, in fact, good cheese and good wine afterwards. So Max got skewered. And it was increasingly obvious to me that he was very uncomfortable about the whole thing. Because, the first guy who actually asked the question was another one of our guests, Graham Priest, who is one of the top logicians in the world. And he just went straight in. It's like, okay, can you give me a consistent definition of what you mean by existence and what you mean by mathematical structures?
Well, Max is not a philosopher.
Yeah, but he's taking his career on that notion,
so
right?
It sounds like what you're doing here, and I'm not really taking a position right
Max,
now
are
on
you
whether...
Here? No.
I'm not taking a position on whether you're right or wrong about mathematical Platonism or whether Max is right or wrong, but even if Max's argument is completely incoherent, that doesn't mean that there aren't other coherent arguments for the side that he's on, right?
Sure.
Like this reminds me of Dan Dennett's comment to the effect that there's nothing I hate more than a bad argument for a view that I hold. That it's
yes.
just so persuasive, emotionally persuasive, to hear a bad argument for a view and cause that and have that make you switch to the other side, even if there might be other better arguments that the person could have made if they were able to.
No, that's fair enough. And without harping anymore on Max, because he's a smart and nice guy anyway, the point was different, right? The point was, okay, so I already had started having doubts about Platonism because I was looking, I actually read some of the literature, the primary literature on both sides, and the more I read about this stuff, it's like, yeah, the more I read about it, the more weird this thing actually is, and the more difficult, I think, to defend actually it is. What Max did, it put almost the last nail into the coffin. The last nail in the coffin is, it came out just a few weeks ago, and I'll tell you in a second. But Max, because he's one of those people who actually is in fact very smart, actually does present a very articulate, in book form, a very articulate defense of that idea. And then as soon as somebody who's not even a philosopher of mathematics, but somebody who actually thought about sort of logic and metaphysics, asks the obvious question, you see the whole thing beginning to crumble. And then you start having doubts, like, okay, maybe it's not just him, but maybe it is actually the notion that is indefensible. The last bit about this, and then we can talk about something else you change your mind about. And by the way, we're going to have a few minutes at the end of Q&A. So if you have a question about anything that we may or may not have changed our mind over the last 5 years, this is the time to start thinking about it.
We should have changed our mind about that we didn't.
Right. So the last nail in that particular coffin came a few weeks ago when I started reading a book by one of the people that I would have loved to have on our show, and at some point maybe you'd be able to do it in the next iteration, and that's Smolin, who is a physicist and is well known for being one of the critics of string theory. I know you guys have had a panel discussion about this yesterday. Too bad that Lee wasn't able to attend. Smolin published this interesting book together with Roberto Hunger, who is a philosopher, and the book is called the Singular Universe and the Reality of Time. It's a long book, and it's actually two books. The first part is written by Unger and makes the arguments on philosophical grounds. The second part makes exactly the same arguments, but it's written by Smolin, and it's based on the cosmology and physics. There are several interesting arguments in that book. The three theses of the book are that A, there is in fact a singular universe. That is, they reject any notion of the multiverse. They reject any Shankarolian notion of multiverse interpretations of quantum mechanics and so on and so forth. So that's the first notion. The second notion they put forth is that time is both fundamental and non-emergent property, and that it is real, meaning that there is such a thing as an absolute time, which of course goes against the apparent obvious interpretation of general relativity. They know that. They're physicists. One of them is a physicist, so they deal with that issue. The third notion is interesting, and it's pertinent to this discussion, which is they say mathematics is in fact a human invention, but of a particular type. It's not an arbitrary human invention. It's a kind of human invention that evokes, as they put it, the term that they use is, it evokes objective things once you start thinking about issues in a certain way. So it's not an invention in the same of, it's art. In art, you can, put whatever you want on the canvas and it's fine. Nobody's going to tell you, no, you can't do that. It's not a discovery, however, in the Platonist sense of the term either. It's a little more, the analogy is imperfect, but it's a little more like once you invent a complex game, such as chess, let's say, initially, there's no truth of the matter. Before chess is invented, there is no truth of the matter about which moves are most appropriate for which situations, because there is no such a thing as a situation yet. But once you do invent the game, then there are objective truths, objective things that can be discovered. And they would be discovered by anybody sharing the same kind of set of rules about how to play chess and about certain consequences. So that's the way they see mathematics. And this was the first time that I heard not just a negative argument about mathematical Platonism. They go through, they rehash the standard negative argument, but actually a positive proposal, counter-proposal. There's an entire really interesting chapter in the second part of the book by Smolin, where he actually goes in details about this proposal, and he fleshes out this notion of evoking truths as opposed to either inventing them or discovering them. So that was the last nail in the coffin, and it took me about 5 years to go from, yes, mathematical Platonism to, maybe to, this is crazy, to, now I know why it's crazy.
So what I think is interesting about that trajectory is, this is actually another thing I'd completely forgotten about, but I've changed my mind about this as well. I've changed my mind about how to change your mind. So
it's a meta-changing of your mind.
Yeah. I used to think of changing one's mind as sort of a discrete event. You're like, walking along, you're believing in mathematical Platonism or whatever, and then you encounter a rebuttal, and if you're, epistemically virtuous, you acknowledge that the rebuttal is correct, and then, boom, you've changed your mind, and now you're walking along not believing in mathematical Platonism or whatever.
Right.
And
you see a fork and you take it.
Right. And I think this is not, in fact, how people do change their minds, and I think it's also not how they should change their minds most of the time.
Right.
I think we've talked on the show before about Bayesianism as this sort of process of gradually updating increasing or decreasing your confidence in your beliefs or in various claims as you get new evidence. And I think especially if you had a relatively confident belief in something all your life or for a long time, that one new piece of evidence or even one new convincing sounding argument probably shouldn't be enough to immediately change your mind. And it should go into what philosophers sometimes call abeyance. In science, if you look at how paradigms of science shift, usually what happens is not that there's one new discovery and then one paradigm, the entire reigning paradigm is overthrown. There are anomalies that are discovered and that sort of accumulate. Someone notices that Mars traces a weird path across the night sky that isn't consistent with the geocentric model of the universe, and people don't go, okay, well then the geocentric model is wrong. They go, that's interesting. So they sort of have a little bit of extra doubt about the geocentric model, but they don't throw it out. And then eventually, once you discover more and more anomalies, or you discover new models that explain the path of Mars better than the old model did, et cetera, then gradually you shift. And I think this is actually how we should aspire to change our minds as well. And I think that the fact that people think of changing their mind as a discrete process is actually preventing them from doing so.
Right.
So if you encounter one new piece of evidence or argument that challenges what you believe, and you think that your choices are either change my mind right now, abandon my long-held belief, or reject the, or like find a reason why the evidence is false, it seems so absurd to completely abandon your belief, and it basically is. And so if you think your other option is finding a reason why the evidence is false, then you're going to find a way to do that. And you're going to continue along, just as confident as you were before. Yeah. Whereas instead, if you just said, that's interesting, I don't quite know how to reconcile that with my view of the world, I'll just sort of keep that in the back of my mind.
So it's okay to be agnostic about stuff, or to have different degrees of belief, right?
To have different degrees of belief.
Belief comes in degrees. It doesn't come in yes or no. Should we have the Q&A? Q&A?
Yeah.
So we have a microphone over there.
All right.
Stage left, which means to your right. And yes, the light, even better. And we'll see if anybody has questions about what things we might have changed our minds, or we should change our mind, or maybe an instance where you change your mind about something that you were actually strongly convinced of.
Yeah?
Yes, we got one.
Hi, long-time listener, first-time caller. I've always wanted to say that. I've listened to your podcast, well, more or less on and off over the last many years. And I'm wondering, the format has basically stayed the same. I'm wondering if you've given any thought to format changes that have crossed your mind, or...
Yeah. So changing our mind about the format.
Exactly.
Right. I have thought about that. In fact, I'll be playing with some different things, but what I'd like to try is having more debates. So the episode coming out with Sean Carroll has sort of, the title of the episode is "The Many Worlds Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics is Probably Correct." And so we're, over the course of the whole episode, we're sort of discussing pros and cons, like arguments for and against this particular claim. And it's not a debate in the sense of Sean and I are each on opposite sides and we're trying to win the debate. It's just sort of a collaborative process of trying to figure out the right answer together. He has a bit of a head start on me, admittedly. But this is the model that I really like for debate. This is what I think debate should be, basically. And so for future episodes, what I'm hoping to do is center many, I don't know about all of the episodes, around a particular claim. I'll bring on a guest who has a claim that they think is, probably right or probably wrong or maybe just interesting, and we'll sort of try to get down to the truth about it together. And I also might actually do two or more separate interviews about a topic to separately interview experts and try to, because people will say things and I'll think, well, I don't know if that's true or not. If it is true, it's a pretty good argument, but I don't have the background to know, and I can't do the research right on the spot. So it might be nice, enlightening to be able to end the interview and then follow up with another expert and say, so, Sean Carroll said this. What do you think about that?
Right.
And
Actually, I think I like that idea also because it's much better, I think, to have these diffuse, ongoing conversations, like precisely have one with Sean Carroll where clearly he has a point of view. I mean, and he's going to push that point of view. He's not going to be objective in the sort of, this God's eye view about things. He has his
but
own.
who can?
Right, exactly. Nobody can. And therefore, this idea that topics like that can possibly be approached with entire objectivity is nonsense. So a much better way of doing it is to revisit the same topic occasionally with different people and different perspectives, so that over a period of time, people actually are exposed to a reasoned, well-articulated point of view, set of point of view on a particular question. Do we have a second over there? Yeah.
This is for Massimo. I remember several years ago noticing that you were dismissive, I think, of evolutionary psychology, and not just pop evolutionary psychology that we all are dismissive of, but even evolutionary psychology as a lens through which to better understand human nature and morality. And I think I heard you say recently that your concerns have softened, or your views have softened a little in that area. Is that true, and if so, what?
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
It's not that.
Well, but you're onto something. So no, my views have changed, but in a little more complicated way. So I think my analysis now of evolutionary psychology is that it has actually branched into at least a couple of different areas. In fact, I was talking to a colleague of mine, Jonathan Kaplan, who is a philosopher of science who has actually followed the evolutionary psychological literature very closely over the last several years. I was talking to him just a few days ago, and he sort of confirmed my understanding of where the field is. So it looks like what I would consider, and of course this is admittedly my perspective on things, but what I would consider the more reasonable and better done evolutionary psychology, now it's done on mainstream evolutionary biology journals or human genetics journals, and those people tend not to call themselves evolutionary psychologists. They tend to use terms like, human ecology or human behavioral ecology or things like that. And then there is another group that, on the other hand, is sort of entrenching into what you call pop evolutionary psychology or close to it. And those people now are publishing only on their own journals. They're having only their own conferences, and basically they're talking to themselves, and the rest of the both philosophical and scientific community is essentially ignoring them. It's going to be interesting to see where that goes, right? Because we've seen that kind of thing before. For instance, one recent example is the still existing community about cold fusion. Now, cold fusion is much worse than evolutionary psychology to begin with. But that's what happened was that for a time there was a discussion to be had in the mainstream scientific community, and then that discussion was over, but a fringe group sort of started doing things on their own, and essentially they spiraled out into a full-fledged pseudoscience at this point. I don't think that's going to happen to evolutionary psychology, partly because it's not as bad as cold fusion, and partly because it's a larger group of people. But right now it looks to me like that's what's happening, that there's this splitting of the two groups, one that really doesn't want to use the label because now it's kind of fraught with baggage, essentially, and they are doing good work, and so there's no reason why they should stick with that baggage. And the other one that, on the other hand, sort of is entrenching and insisting. Now, interestingly, of course, this is sort of a repetition of a repetition, because evolutionary psychology itself as a term was introduced because in order to replace the earlier term, which was sociobiology, which was introduced by E.O. Wilson in 1975, and that's because that one got a huge backlash in terms of the soundness of their scientific pronouncements and as well as the social implications of what they were doing. So actually, evolutionary psychology is already a term of replacement, and I think that the people that are doing mainstream, good evolutionary psychology are right to not use the term at all and just fold what they're doing into the broader field of human behavioral ecology, because that's where it probably belongs.
I don't actually know how much time we have left. Can
A few
someone on
minutes,
the
I
wings
think.
let us know?
As far as I can tell, we have a few more minutes.
Is that we don't? Oh, we do. Oh, okay.
All right.
Well,
She got some kind of.
I just wanted to take while we still have time. I just wanted to take an opportunity to give a tiny little token parting gift to Massimo. This is a bottle of Kinoto, which is what Massimo drinks during the recording of every podcast. And
that's right.
I thought perhaps in your absence we should just pour a bottle of Kinoto down the drain
there you
every
go.
time we record to honor your absence.
But that would be a waste. Just send it to me. It's okay. Thank you.
And actually, I'd like to just take a moment and tell you how much I'm going to miss your presence on the show.
Oh.
I haven't really gotten to express this publicly, but I will miss our sparring over philosophy. I will miss having someone there to explain to me why everything is actually secretly connected to Hume and Plato and Aristotle. I will miss getting to translate your Italian accent for our audiences. I will miss your incredible breadth of knowledge and insight and intellectual curiosity and pleasure in intellectual engagement. And I will miss you.
That's very nice. This was I didn't tell her to say that, so this is all actually genuine. It is very nice. The feeling is, of course, reciprocal. I also would like to thank a few other people. Obviously, New York City Skeptics is not only putting up this conference, it's been sponsoring the podcast from the beginning. They've done a great job. They actually proposed this idea to begin with initially, and I was rather skeptical of the idea of doing a podcast. Although Benny now, our producer, seems to have a different story, which he can back up. He thinks he can back that up with facts. I don't care about facts. Speaking of
now
Benny,
that the podcast's over, you can relax and admit you never cared about facts to begin with.
Speaking of Benny, a big thank to him. I actually wanted him on the stage today, but he's too damn shy to do that sort of stuff. Yes, please,
yeah,
an
Benny.
applause. Absolutely. Benny is literally the person who literally and metaphorically pushes our buttons. He's the one that pushes us to do things and in directions where necessarily not we wouldn't necessarily go. But he also pushes the buttons and makes sure that everything is good. We have not lost a single episode. We got close, as in taping. We got close once. We had a lost episode, which was missing for a little bit, and then we recovered it. So in 5 years, Benny has managed not to lose a single episode of the podcast, which is incredible. At some point, we thought of making him an occasional sort of outside guest to the podcast because he has comments. He makes comments throughout the taping, which of course then get deleted. And we thought of actually making him a feature, calling him the voice of God. And sort of, but he's too shy for that as well. So it's like, maybe that's something that's going to happen in the next iteration. So
I'll work on him.
Thanks to everybody. Thanks also, of course, to the people who have been listening to the podcast. We have tens of thousands of listeners everywhere I go. I'm told by colleagues, students, and just and people that I meet that how much they love the podcast and how they enjoy it and how much they learn about things from listening to our entirely off-the-cuff discussions. Our discussions are usually not prepared. We prepare just the topic, and then each one of us does separate readings and takes several notes. We don't compare notes at the beginning, so the whole thing is entirely spontaneous because we think that that's the way it works best. And okay, that's it. I'm done because otherwise I'm going to start being more emotional about it, which of course would be, how does that work with the Straw Vulcan again?
It's allowed.
It's allowed, okay. All right, should we wrap it up then?
I think we should wrap up, yeah.
I think it's your job.
Oh, that's right. That's my job. All right. Well, thank you all for listening for all these years. Thank you for being here and for supporting this podcast.
Yes, thank you.